Well, thanks everyone for joining us. So on behalf of the Virtual Presence Committee, so I'm the outgoing chair of the Virtual Presence Committee. My name's Ron Follett. Steve Haywood, who is there with child, is the incoming president of the Virtual Presence Committee. And this is an idea kind of several years in the making. Ironically, the point of this, when it was initially presented, was to get people who are influencers in social media physically together so that we could finally see each other face to face. And this is the reality of where we are. And hopefully we will still have an excellent session to really probe into how these excellent gurus in social media really use their platform in a number of varied ways and kind of dive into that expertise of advocacy and societal interests and translating it into an academic career. So the overall session plan will be to kind of introduce each of the panelists and have them talk about how kind of in their niche of using social media to develop their academic emergency medicine profile, and then have them talk about that and then kind of open it up for Q&A. We have at least 3 or 4 SAM members here. If you guys have questions, you can just put them in the chat since we're all in Zoom, and we'll go ahead and queue those up afterwards. So first up, Megan. So Megan Rainey works at Rhode Island Hospital and associate professor at Brown University. During COVID-19, she's used her social media profile, online influence to advocate for PPE, and obviously developed a firm, the American Foundation for Firearm Injury Reduction in Medicine, and has consistently used her online profile for advocacy work and translating it into means of dissemination through kind of lay press. So Dr. Rainey, thank you for joining us, and floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. LaFollette. It is a joy to be here, especially with 2 folks who I first met through Twitter and then became real life friends with. So this is kind of, to now be virtual on a panel together is like a full circle of the 3 of our relationship. I'll speak for just a couple minutes about my journey. I think that kind of most of the interest of this panel will come from the 3 of us having a conversation, but I'll provide a little overview for those who don't know me. So as Dr. LaFollette said, I am at Brown University. I've been here since my internship, so almost 20 years now. And I got active on Twitter about a decade ago. Esther Chu and I joined Twitter at the same time because we both had little kids and needed something to keep us engaged in the evenings when we couldn't go out or kind of be doing other work. And at that point, it was really just informational. It was about I remember some of my first tweets were about the SAEM meeting back in 2011, just about a decade ago, sharing what sessions were happening in which room, and trying to create some connections between folks that were attending the conference. Obviously, the purpose of Twitter has changed over the last decade, but it's changed sometimes slowly and then sometimes with these huge paradigm shifts. And I look at my work on Twitter pre-COVID and I kind of divide it into 2 phases. Pre-COVID, there was that, or I guess 3. So there was that first phase, which was just getting my feet wet. The second phase was starting to use Twitter very actively to create networks and affiliations and academic work online. And that was where Dr. Truger and Dr. Chan and I connected, was in that kind of early phase of how do we use Twitter to help advance academia, to help advance emergency medicine, to help to create connections and networks. We even published a paper together that we wrote that we call our Twitter paper, and was written almost entirely through direct messages and then through virtual collaboration, which at that point was a very strange and weird thing. And then the third phase of my Twitter involvement pre-COVID was around my work around firearm injury prevention. I think of my work in gun violence as being similar to my work in Twitter, where I started doing it at a time where everybody thought I was silly or misguided to be spending my time on an issue that nobody cared about. But one of the things that Twitter did for me was it created a community of other folks who cared about firearm injury as a public health problem. And I'd worked to create this community for years, including with the founding of a firm, which Dr. LaFollette mentioned, had, after some of the horrific mass shootings, used the Twitter platform to share stories about why firearm injury was about more than just mass shootings, but was really a general public health problem here in the United States. Had done work after the Las Vegas shooting, Parkland, et cetera. And then that Twitter community really took off and bore fruit with the "This Is Our Lane" hashtag in November of 2018. For those who don't remember, the NRA put out a tweet after the American College of Physicians published a paper telling doctors to stay in their lane, that gun violence wasn't our problem. And in part because of this work that I and others had done on Twitter over the prior years, this hashtag, "This Is Our Lane," just took off and went viral. And for the first time, folks talked about firearm injury not just as a tragedy for the victims, but as a true public health problem. And I really credit that hashtag with driving the House and the Senate to finally fund firearm injury prevention research for the first time in 25 years, or 24 years, last year. So that was the pre-COVID work. Then there's been the peri-COVID Twitter presence. And over the last year, I've gotten verified, my Twitter involvement and utilization has kind of gone through the roof, not intentionally, but it was just, same purposes as what I used it for pre-COVID, to share information, to create networks, to do some kind of creation of original work. The importance of that to the world obviously expanded 1,000-fold during COVID. It also is what led to creation of another organization, Get Us PPE, which came about because of a hashtag that Esther created, Get Me PPE, that also went viral, just as This Is Our Lane had. And we worked with Ali Raja, Shuhan Hay, Jeremy Faust, Esther, Valerie Griffith, and many others across the country to create this organization to distribute personal protective equipment to those who needed it most. A funny twist of fate, a firm, my firearm injury nonprofit, served as the fiscal sponsor for Get Us PPE. And we recruited both volunteers, but also donations of PPE and of money through Twitter. And so Twitter became, during COVID, again, that information sharing, but also a place to organize and to help to drive real change on an even larger scale than what we had done with This Is Our Lane. And now I feel like we're moving into certainly not the post-COVID world, but the post-pandemic world. And it's going to be really interesting to see how my use of social media changes. Obviously, there are a lot more forms of social media than there were a decade ago when I got on Twitter. We've got TikTok, we've got Instagram, we've got Clubhouse, which I've dipped my toes into, but those may be the spaces where other people make their voices heard. It's been interesting, and I'll be interested in Teresa's and Seth's perspectives here. To me, one of the interesting things about Twitter over the last month or two has been watching this unified public health and healthcare voice start to fragment. And so I'm curious about a year from now, what I'll be saying about social media for advocacy and for change, and how important Twitter will still be versus other forms of social media versus other forms of media, period. But I think my biggest takeaway from all of this is just the importance of being active on these public facing channels and of engaging in the discussion. So I'll stop there and I'll pass it to whoever Dr. LaFollette would like to turn it to next.
Well, excellent. And I think that generates a bunch of questions that I do not want to steal from the other two members of our panel. So let's turn it over to Teresa if we can. So Dr. Chan's an associate professor at McMaster University, clinical educator in Hamilton, Ontario, holds a number of positions in traditional editorial boards, as well as online editorial boards at canadiam.org and ALEM. As well as the Journal of GME and Perspectives on Medical Education, AEM-ENT as traditional scholarly outlets. Dr. Chan has brought attention to the value of online academic activity and translation and dissemination. And Dr. Chan, the floor is yours.
Sure. I mean, I'll just respond. I think that the world before, I think Megan, myself, and Seth, we were out there talking about the um, Twitter and all these like technologies as if they were some kind of brave new world. And lo and behold, flash forward, not even 5-6 years later, it is that brave new world, and we are living in a very different reality than before. And that I think the COVID pandemic has had a huge impact on all of our lives and has irrevocably probably changed our educational systems, has opened up a lot more people to interfacing digitally, has connected people around understanding disparities in health, for instance, more in a visible way, but it has highlighted the need for all of us to become more engaged citizens with the world. I think healthcare has become a pillar of society, has become something that everyone is worried about. And in the past, we might have been an issue once in a while when an election came along and people would talk about it, but it's now on everyone's front of mind. And I think that what we can do is really capitalize on that. And I think that we have to take to the airwaves and the the Wi-Fi and all of these other techniques to reach people, because if we don't get out there, then the Jenny McCarthy's of the world, they win. And right now, in the anti-vax movement is so strong. We need to be able to speak truth. Generally speaking, it's not even truth to power; it's just truth to many, and convince people and listen to them well, because I think in order to reach them, we're going to have to listen more. And so we do have to do as much as talking and advocacy as we need to do listening and building empathy, because I think that one of the big gaps is that we're not reaching the audiences that need us the most, and we need to figure out how to do that. So that's my thought about where the next phase of things need to go.
That is excellent. Thank you very much. And then before we engage in dialogue, let's get Seth's 2 cents and perhaps his future TikTok handle. So Seth Truger is an emergency medicine physician at Northwestern University, who has used his online presence to disseminate research as well as medical knowledge, as well as add his own personal flair to his social media profile. And he currently serves as a digital media editor at JAMA Network Open since 2018, with a focus of his research being on social media use, medical education, and most recently, as of today, I believe, gender disparities within social media use, which is an excellent article. So Seth, the floor is yours.
Thanks. And thank both of you for talking about advocacy, because I don't talk about that, or I'm not going to talk about that right now. I do a little bit, but basically a much smaller and watered down version of what Megan does. Also, I just want to point out, I unfortunately have some health issues and have some dysarthria. So number one, if you think I'm slurring, I am. And number two, I have the chat open. If you have trouble hearing what I say or anything, send me a message. I will try to clarify. We don't need to talk about it now, but feel free to reach out to me separately if you want to talk about it. So basically, I'm going to talk a little bit about just social media for education and academia. I also joined Twitter during SAM 2011. I was at the it was the consensus conference on crowding, and I remember sitting there and being like, wow, these lectures are great. I really want to pay attention, but I'm a typical, pseudo ADD ER doc, and I need to do something else or I'm not going to pay attention. If I play Angry Birds, I'm not going to pay attention. So I signed up for Twitter on Nick Jeans' iPad and started tweeting at pearls. And basically just realized, oh, I can do this as a kind of way to engage. I can learn stuff here. I started building community with both professional colleagues and building real friendships. And it's been great. My kind of philosophy on social media for education is there basically two different spectra that it works on. First is kind of temporary things like Twitter or conversations. And then it kind of spreads out to at the other end, more permanent things like blogs and podcasts that, basically exist and are there and stay forever. And a lot of this stuff falls in various places across that spectrum. The other axis is kind of informal versus formal. So ad hoc chats or someone throwing up an informal blog post versus more rigorous, websites like Academic Life in EM or other blogs like Canadium that have schedules and staffs and editorial processes that are much more, I don't know, rigorous, structured, oftentimes have peer review of some sort. And also, many of these can be integrated in curricula. So, versus like me deciding to listen to MCRIT when I was a resident to get information versus, the now triple I in residencies where you have an hour left conference and have to do some sort of stuff in your free time. So I think that's kind of the overall framework I think of. It's all very fluid. It's not dichotomous at all. As far as social media use in academia, I think we're starting to see a little bit of some places giving credit for blogs and podcasts, but it's really hard. Even places that are, I think, at the head of the curve there are still is a very small piece of it, and it's very hard to get real credit for doing it. And even then, it's a very small piece of it. Even some of the best stuff, like a really well done blog or podcast, is essentially curricular design, which is essentially traditional scholarly work. And that's kind of what my kind of MO has been through my career on social media, is that to do things like write papers with basically Megan and Teresa, because they can't say, "Oh, you're just doing stuff on social media." This is stuff that's published in peer-reviewed journals. Um, you can be. People are. I don't know. Kind of. Sometimes can be dismissive of the work that is on here, but it's still. If you're in a journal, it's got impact factor. It's got page views. People are reading it. People are citing it. It's hard to dismiss. The kind of things that we've worked on, things like studying, how many people use social media. Do residents use Twitter to listen to podcasts? Do residencies incorporate into the curriculum? One of the things that I kind of jumped on Dr. Chan's work is assessing quality. How do you measure quality in social media products? And part of my kind of broader thought there was, if we can figure out how to assess quality and show something is good, then we can reward quality and people can be better rewarded for the work. Unfortunately, the main answer of our research is that it's really hard to assess quality. So I don't know. We got a lot of work out of it. Interesting, but it's a hard. I ended up having the opportunity to be a social media editor first at Annals and now at Gemma Network Open. And it's been really an interesting opportunity. And basically, the main idea with journals use social media is, if a tree falls in the forest, no one hears it. If a journal publishes a paper, no one reads it. Doesn't matter at all. So the whole thing is to do stuff like promote papers, do things like visual abstract, video discussions, do studies on the journal work, and use that as a way to drive traffic. There's a lot of different reasons journals do this and how they measure them. I like spectra. So to think about a spectrum, like number one is to just get the information out there. So someone reads my tweet, the visual abstract, and they get the bullet points from the paper. The other end of the spectrum is it's just a flashy and colorful thing that tricks somebody into clicking the link to go to the paper and read the paper. Again, not a dichotomy, and a lot of it depends on what your journal decided wants to prioritize. The way to measure things like alt metrics, which measure a number of things like tweets, retweets, blog post links, article links, and things like that, versus the actual engagement on social media or the traffic to the website. A lot of journals, from what I can tell, care about website traffic because they sell ads. So that matters. That's the bottom line. But it can also be everything. My general philosophy, I don't get paid per the ad revenue. So I know people aren't going to read most of the papers. People joke that the median citation for a paper is 0. And that, on average, 7 people read your paper, and that includes you and your mom. We're very fortunate to have people who have some pretty well read papers here, but so that's probably not, rare outliers. But really, most stuff doesn't get read. But if we can get stuff out there, then people read it. And then I'll just circle back to one of the fun parts about all of this is that I've really built a pretty big professional and personal community online, and people, conferences back in the before time where you can go in real life, like, are a ton more fun when I can see all my friends. I've read a ton of different people, or met a ton of different people, made a ton of real, legitimate friendships with people online that are a big part of my life. So it's really been great, both personally and professionally. Um, I don't want to get too much into advocacy, but especially in COVID, it's really having, what I've done is very, a tiny fraction of what Megan's done, but it's the same general idea, and it's really helped give me a sense of, I don't know, what's the word, agency during the pandemic. That, yes, we get to see patients engage the pandemic head on, but also get to engage the public and advocate for public health and for help of people, which has really been fulfilling for me. And I think I will end there.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Seth. So why don't we open it up and see? I want to give the panelists time to react to each other, because there's been a lot of both chat and facial commentary of the reaction. So open it up to the audience who's here. Does anyone have any questions for our panelists?
So Seth, I love that you talked about some people just wanting to get shock value with their posts versus wanting to get clicks. Teresa put in the chat, clickbait titles. I'm starting to get into social media in kind of TikTok, Instagram, where people expect something with some shock value, and I struggle with how much of that do I feed into versus maintaining why I'm doing it, which is to educate and to advocate. How have y'all found that balance first of getting exposure so your message gets out there versus maintaining why you do it?
Oof, it's a great question, Stephen, and I have no right answers. In fact, I will say this is a frequent topic of discussion. Seth and Jeremy Faust and I were actually Swami were messaging about this about an hour ago. So I think there's a little bit of trial and error. I think for me, there are a couple of core precepts that I try to keep. The first is that I try to always have my voice be my own. So sometimes I may come off as a little like, oh my God, this is crazy. But anyone that knows me knows that that's actually how I am in real life. So make it your own voice. And then also tell the truth. Now, sometimes we're all going to make mistakes, right? And that's inevitable. I have made mistakes and taken things back. And I think probably Teresa and Seth have as well. But don't ever purposefully spread stuff. And I know you wouldn't, but I do think it's important to say, because I do think people put stuff out there where they put a very purposeful twist in order to get attention. And then the last part is there are people that get attention by being negative. And you don't want to be that person either, because you create like a little network of other negative, backstabby people for yourself, and they're going to stab you in the back at some point too. So try it. And if, all of us try slightly different techniques, it's actually kind of fun sometimes to put out the same message at different times of day, or with slightly different words, or with a picture or a GIF rather than just the text, and to see what happens. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But that basic like integrity and honest, like be yourself and be honest stuff, you won't go wrong. I don't know, Seth and Teresa, what are your thoughts?
Teresa, go ahead.
Sure. I mean, to me, it's about figuring out what your brand is, right? So Megan clearly has a good center on who she wants to be. She wants to be a truth teller. She wants to be someone who is herself, authentic, right? So if she would say OMG, she's going to write OMG, right? And that's good. And then figure out what your topic domains are and what you want to comment. You could comment on everything, but I feel like that's exhausting. So a brand helps you filter some of that too, right? And so I stick to medical education, faculty development. Sometimes I wander into food stuff, but like usually I try to stay out of it because no one really cares that I like pineapple on pizza or something, but once in a while, right? But it'll be usually filtered by the fact that most of my life stuff will be so that people know there's work-life balance and that I'm not just a workaholic, because I think there's impressions that I am and lots of rumors that I don't sleep. And so I have to, I haven't started tweeting pictures of me going to sleep yet, because I feel like that's a little bit much. But at the same time, I do think you have to make some boundaries and figure out what that is. However, do I go to an escape room and tweet a victory picture of that. Of course, that's not something I can realistically do during the COVID pandemic, so I'm not going to do it now, but like I did it previously. And so I think there's different ways that you can handle it. To me, I think it's just about what you want to represent to the world. So remember, your Twitter is a great portal for that ambassadorship of your brand. And so figure out what your brand is and then stay true to it. Sometimes that requires, putting up a note to remind yourself what that is. Sometimes it's about using your faculty statement. If you're at this conference, you probably are faculty somewhere. So thinking about your promotion statement, what did you put on there? Like use it to actually help you refine your brand and stick to it. That's what I would suggest. And the only thing I would say is as you climb up the ladder, there may be pressures for you to act a certain way and be a certain way. You have to just make a decision as to whether or not you're going to subscribe to that. There are people like I'm thinking of Seth and I have a collaborator, Vinny Aurora. She's just become the undergraduate dean. She's pretty awesome, but she's gonna write OMG sometimes. But like there might be someone in her university now that will say you need to take that down or to manage her. So you at certain levels you might actually get some interference from your employers or your folks, and so you just have to navigate that, right? Because there are social media policies, and to be honest, most of them don't enforce your average Jane or Joe or Sanjay like faculty member, but they do care if the dean does treat a certain way. So you may be asked to change that brand as you go up into your career, right? If you're a chair, again, you may have to be sensitive to vice chair, right? Those are the kind of things. So that's the realistic part of it, is that like I think you need to stay on brand and you got to figure out what that brand is, and at some point your brand may evolve. And it might not be your choice sometimes. Well, it might have been your choice because you wanted to be dean, right? So like you kind of, open that door, I guess. All right, I'll kick it to Seth.
Yeah, I will say I think what Dr. Rennie said, you're really being yourself, and I mean, true, that to me is the number one thing. I'm pretty, I don't know, both casual and formal online, but also I think very much reflective of who I am. I had a lot of people tell me my online persona is exactly the same as how I am in real life, which I'm glad. um, I think that one of the main reasons I'm not anonymous online is because I want me to know that everyone knows who I am online, and that theoretically my mom and my chair can see these things. I know my JNO boss reads some of my tweets because I've written on the comments, but I've also, like, a few months ago when there was that thing about the podcast at Jamba, I kind of was like, hey, I've been cautious online about this. Should I tweet about it? And he's like, why are you asking me? So I'm very lucky. I've got bosses who appreciate what's in line, but I also recognize, sometimes when I post, I don't just stick to medicine. When I post some silly stuff or things about news articles and stuff that aren't related to medicine, or just some kind of silly stuff that, like, chairs of non-emergency medicine departments sometimes like them. It's and that to me, like, serious people who are like serious clinicians and researchers and department heads like my posts. And this also, I think, not, and the point is not my post rate and like them. The point is that we're all people, and I think sometimes we assume that everything's more buttoned up than we think, and a lot of it is us setting expectations for ourselves because we think they're there. And I know I'm a white guy with a beard and gray hair, so it's easier for me in a lot of ways, as our paper today shows. But it's also, I think, it's easy to be more cautious and people sometimes want to be human. I remember when I was a student rotating at where I ended up doing residency, I worked a fast track shift with the chair at the time. And at the end of the shift, he's like, you're just kind of serious. And so I'm like, yeah, I'm intimidated working with the chair. I'm a fourth year student. And that's fun to me. The second thing I'm going to say is I'm a very big believer that other than the potential for like spread and speed, there's nothing unique about the social media community outside of the real world. And the fact that, I mean, two of my favorite titles to Annals articles are, they're both editorials, but one is Take 'em Down with the Ketamine Blow Dart, which is written by one of the deputy editors at Annals. Another one is don't hate the player, hate the game. And one of the authors, Brendan Carr, who's now the chair at Sinai and used to work at HSS, like these are serious people making funny jokes in the titles at the Leading Emergency Medicine Journal. Like people have fun with this stuff in the stodgy bowtie world. We can do fun stuff online too. It's not like this dichotomy of Twitter silly and journals are shit serious. So yes, there are plenty of people. I'm sure the dean of Northwestern, if he saw some of my tweets, would totally roll his eyes and not care. But I'm also, he only cares about grants, so it doesn't matter. I'm not on his radar because I don't get grants. But that being said, there are also a lot of times where I throttle what I'm saying because, again, I know my name's on it. For instance, last few days, I've been doing some, I don't know, public health advocacy, pushing back on one of the negative people Dr. Rennie was implicitly talking about before. And I was, wanting to say all the snarky things and all the little, spurs and owens and fun stuff that would have cracked me up. And I purposely bit my tongue a lot and didn't because I knew there's a chance that he was going to, I don't know, either take any ground I gave as unprofessional or silly and say, look, you're not taking it seriously, or, email my provost. And like, I don't really care. And I'm pretty sure if my provost saw my tweets, he'd be like, who cares? But I didn't want to get into a thing. So I'll stop there.
So I'll do one kind of final thing, and then I saw that Catherine put a question in, which I want to get to, but this will relate back to your question, Catherine, about med Twitter and med students. It's interesting. I've actually been having discussions. I think many of you know that I recently took a position as associate dean at the School of Public Health here at Brown. And so my dean is Ashish Shah, who's probably one of the most prolific tweeters and kind of media personalities around COVID. And we've had discussions about how to us, and I think Vinny, who's a friend, Vinny Aurora is another great example. I actually think the next generation of medical and academic leadership has to have a social media profile. I think there's no way to engage. I mean, to me, this is part of the reshaping of academia. And we can be like, oh, it's too controversial to be on academics, but then you miss these huge discussions. And I look at what happened at JAMA with the very, very appropriate blowback around a podcast around racism in medicine, with two white guys saying that it wasn't a real thing. And I think the fact that the editor of JAMA wasn't on Twitter, he missed it. I mean, he missed it for other reasons too, but like, had he been active on social media, he would have gotten how important and horrible it was and potentially done something. Now, again, we can talk about that separately. But like, I think you lose your finger on kind of the social zeitgeist. And like to Teresa's point, we want our voices to be out there, but you also have to be aware of what's going on in the world. And if you're getting your knowledge about what's going on in the world by reading Time magazine, right, which is like a weekly, you're 8 days too late at this point. It might be a good source for some opinion, but it's not a source for news. And then to the med Twitter point, I also would say, right, like we all need to read our textbooks, but if you're getting your medical education from your textbook, you're about 5 to 10 years too late. And you really need to be online there. And I think Teresa and Seth, among many, many others, have been absolute trailblazers in terms of creating the free and open access medical education movement, which then brings me to Catherine's great question about med students and kind of your role on Twitter. I think it's a great place to be. And I've created friendships with students and mentor. I mean, I think you and I, did we originally meet through Twitter, I think, Catherine? And then Catherine started volunteering with a firm and like, has been awesome. And then fingers crossed, we get you a great emergency medicine residency, but like met through social media. So I think it's really important to be there, but I think those same basic precepts apply, which is that you want to be honest and be yourself. I do know of a couple of people whose Twitter profiles were so snarky and mean that they were noticed by residency directors. And so it's the one and only time that I would say potentially consider being anonymous, is if you're like a super snarky person and like want to be like your full angry self. But I would also say probably go to therapy rather than creating that anonymous handle. Since we don't need more snarky people out in social media. So, but otherwise, I think it's a great place to be. And I would say also, again, not just Twitter, but also Clubhouse and TikTok and other places. And yeah, so I'm interested in Teresa's and Seth's thoughts there.
So I actually do the social, he finally asked me at my medical school to do the social media lecture in the beginning of medical school boot camp. It only took like 120 papers and like in the domain before they actually finally asked me. And then at that point they were like, do you think she'll say yes? She's so busy. And my friend was like, hold on a second. She texted me. I texted back in like 3 minutes. And yeah, she says she'd do it. Just make sure you pick a date she's available. That it was that easy. And what I would say is that I think that's the reason why we are on Twitter, because there's this perception that you can't reach me. I'm like, there are like 5 ways to reach me instantly. Like, what are you talking about? Right. Like, and I think that if any of the faculty members from that committee had just known how often I am sitting in front of my email and my Twitter, and they know that they could have just DM'd me and just asked me, right, at any point, right? So I do think that there's a gap. There's a gap that's generational. There's a gap that requires some capacity building. There's a gap that probably requires me to sit down with I had to sit down with one of our associate chairs and like, you are a woman who is on the rise in academia. I'm starting a Twitter account for you right now. What would you like it to be? And then I loaded on her phone and started it with her. I did it on the computer. And I think that that's how we do it, right? And so as a medical student, you have a superpower. You know how to use social media almost intuitively. And if you look around at Fortune 500 companies, the youngest executive is usually, they start off as a social media person, right? Seth and I were like, how many years in, doing social media editing for journals, like 1 year into faculty, and I'm decision editing journal articles. Well, guess what? That means that I got opportunities faster, sooner. And I made assistant dean in my late 30s rather than waiting till I was 50 or 60. So having these early talents that you can use, and it won't be as exceptional unless you're nerding out like large, like with people here where you might get looped in on a project or two and make your mark, right? But I do think it's worthwhile knowing that there is a skill set to be leveraged here that can help you make your academic mark. And what I would say is that if you're mindful of it, just like you are, if you've got a natural talent, let's say for Instagramming, you know what? Residency programs are like, how do we get and attract talent right now, right? Advising someone to help them figure out their Instagram strategy is not a bad way to get to know a really good program director, right? And so these are the ways that I think you can leverage some of these interests that you have into strategic positioning. And as a medical student, I mean, Megan and I both met Eve Purdy, I think first online. Eve Purdy is now a faculty member in Australia doing like our fellowship or something like that after doing the 5-year slow learner program we have in Canada. And so she did her medical anthropology in the middle of all that. We have a baked-in fellowship. That's why it takes so long. But the idea would be that she did, and now she's publishing really, really great stuff. And she's in Australia because she met Vic Brazel online. And Vic is a rock star simulation educator and was like, come down and do a fellowship. So she went down for her master's and did her fellowship stuff there. And then she came back and she's like, I love Australia. So she's back there again, doing more fellowship, more clinical stuff, right? Yeah.
Miss Eve.
So one thing I think to build on what both of you said is something that struck me throughout my career is the people who are most negative about social media and academic medicine are, I think, the mid-career people, and not the ones who do Twitter and stuff, but the ones who don't. But I've always found like department chairs, top editors journals, even if they don't know what it is, they're like, yeah, that's the thing. It's do good work there. And unfortunately, I think as a student, so I'm going to correct a lot of what I said before, is as a student, you're a junior, and a lot of the people making decisions on things like resident match and evaluation, things like that, are these mid-career skeptical people. So I think it's great to be online. I think it's great to engage in the community and to learn there, but be aware that, being too cynical, being negative, it's easy to get in a situation where you're going to piss off people who aren't as enlightened as Dr. Chan, Dr. Randy about this stuff, or they're going to see the negative stuff and they're, you know what, there's 1,000 applicants. We don't need this one. There might be a problem, even if they're wrong about that. So again, be nice. Remember, you know, everything you're tweeting, your program director, your mom, your chair are going to see. They won't, they don't care most of the time, but they could. The other thing I was going to say is I think again, the kind of broadening the network you get from being online is really helpful. One of the things that it seemed to me when I was applying to residency was that most of my peers were fourth-year students getting their advice from our peers who are fourth-year students like me, and I knew nothing. What business do I have giving people advice? And people asking questions like, oh, who does chest tubes on trauma? Like, is a dumb question nobody cares about. And like a week into residency, you don't care about that. You want to talk to different people, different places, people at the institutions you're applying to. One of my other things, I've been lucky where I've been at a bunch of different places for med school, residency, fellowship, and 2 different faculty spots, and just seeing how much heterogeneity there's in practice. Everyone kind of thinks the way things are done at their, sorry, it's easy to think the way things that are done at your place is the way things are done everywhere. So having a network of people across the country saying, oh, there's different ways people treat this problem. There's people use this for AFib versus that for AFib. You know, this is a very small example, but then when you're a student, you can ask questions like, hey, what do you guys use for RSI or AFib and things like that? And it's a honestly pretty dumb, small question, but it shows like, hey, in my place we do X and what do you do? And there's curiosity and that you want to learn about stuff. And frankly, you get people to talk. When people talk to you, they find you fascinating when they're talking. So, you know, instead of asking the dumb questions, they've answered 4 times already that day and 20 times that season. The other stuff is you get collaborators, you get people different places. 5 years down the road, when you're applying for fellowship, you know, after having applied for residency, many years later, you know people, places you can ask them what's the real deal of that place. Should I stay away? Can you put a word in? Little stuff like that I think can be really helpful as far as building your network. Academics is a pretty small world. A lot of it's connecting. When I was applying for the annual social media editor, I was very fortunate, knew that her ran and was like, hey, what's the real dig here? Do I want to do this? Is this fun? Does it pay? Like I was afraid to ask the actual like official process if it paid, but I could ask her as a friend. And little intangibles like that. So I think you can do it, but I think the professionals, you have to be careful because there are naysayers out there and they will, you know, harp on little slights. The other thing, and I think it's gotten a lot better overall as to what's out there, but a lot of the focus, especially traditionally, it's easy to only do the fun, cool stuff like airway stuff and resuscitation stuff. And really, it's the nuts and bolts. Like everyone should really read an EM textbook. Everyone should do stuff like, you know, yes, it's really cool to figure out, you know, how to find the subtle semi everyone misses, but really it's the chest pain you see every day that matters. And knowing, you know, being able to walk before you run is very important. So, you know, most shifts you're not doing DSI. Most shifts you're seeing chest pain, belly pain. And I think that, you know, the landscape got a lot better. In fact, Canadian started out as boring EM, and there's a lot of has like core EM and basic or EM basic that work on the nuts bolt stuff. But I think just making sure you're getting both the foundation and the interesting stuff is important.
And I know we're almost at 2:50, but I just want to address the question from Dylan about how do you approach sharing recent public health updates with the non-medical community? So I have been known to do hot takes in kind of 11:30 p.m. or 7 in the morning as I'm just getting out of bed. Those are rarely my favorite. So I've learned to try to take half an hour or an hour or 5 hours and compose like a thoughtful response. You know, I think this one in particular took a bunch of, we shouldn't have been taken by surprise because Fauci said it on Sunday, so we knew it was coming. But I'm trying to think about so I think my first answer is like, think about it. And then for the stuff that I think is particularly sticky or difficult, I actually try to run it by some of my non-medical friends, particularly my husband, who's non-medical. I'll be like, hey, does this make sense to you? And he'll kind of call me out on places where it doesn't. But the first thing is to take a breath before you respond. You guys agree?
Yeah, I think also just don't speak. I think for me, one of the things I try to do is not talk about things that I don't know about. I remember when I was in residency and I was a senior resident and I was talking to a junior and said like 3 papers on the topic we were talking about. And the junior was like, wow, you really know all the literature. And the attending was there was Lane Rabin. She turned and she's like, no, he just knows the 3 papers, like incorporated those in really well. He talked about what you know about, like in a way to know what you're talking about is to only talk about what you know about. And I think a lot of people, it can be I don't know, very flattering to have non-medical people ask you for your opinion on stuff, and to realize like 90% of the COVID questions I get are public health questions, not EM questions. And my friends are like, oh, you're an ER doc, what do you think about blah? I'm like, well, first of all, this is not an ER question, this is a public health question. Like, I have no expertise because of that. Like, I happen to know things, so I happen to know things about this, partially because I do some public health and blah, blah, blah. But like, don't answer, I think number one is just don't answer questions you don't have expertise or enough expertise to answer the question.
All right, I think we're out
Awesome.
of time. So thank
Okay.
you guys.